5 years ago, the original Shin Godzilla Deforeal was released. Now, it's evolved into something bigger. This has been one of my most anticipated figures of the year, and I'm finally happy to get my hands on it. I haven't made a big X Plus purchase in a while, but this is a great way to get back into it. So without further ado, let's take a closer look at the figure itself. When it comes to Shin Godzilla's design, it leads toward a naturally complex variety of textures, striations, and coloration throughout the entire body, and this is expertly represented throughout this entire figure. From the torso to the teeth, and to the tip of the tail, there is no expense spared here for this figure. One of the defining features of this particular sculpt that really piqued my interest back when they announced this figure, interestingly enough, is the teeth. The fact that they're individually molded is something that really stood out to me, and as you take a closer look at it, you can just see how it's so jagged and just really expertly represents how they are in the film as well. But of course, it wouldn't be Shin Godzilla if it wasn't an abomination. The teeth aren't just in the mouth, but also on top of the head as well. But perhaps the most grotesque section of the figure is the one that's hidden in plain sight, the inside of the mouth. What sets a great sculpt apart from a good one is its ability to thrive under any lighting condition, and this figure certainly has a great sculpt. Let's take a look at the figure under various natural light conditions. Now, while this figure definitely holds its own, it's almost impossible not to do a side-by-side with the original Shin Godzilla Deforeal release. Next to each other, these figures look excellent, and while their sculpts are similar, they're distinct enough that each has their own unique vibe. Personally, I do think that the smaller Deforeal is the cuter of the two because in comparison it is much more cartoony, whereas the gigantic Deforeal Shin is much more realistic with its textures and overall appearance. And because of that, it's much more unsettling and closer to the actual appearance of Godzilla in the film itself. Side by side, the most apparent similarities are the head pose and the tail position as well. As we look at them next to each other, you can really see how the tail kind of just swings out from the back and comes around to the right side of the head. Now, while this tail pose is good for saving space, I do kind of wish that it was in a slightly different position compared to the original Deforeal release, just to have a little bit more differentiation, but also because when you look at it from this angle, which is one of my favorite angles of this figure, kind of slightly looking up, it gives the effect that there is sort of like a tentacle just coming off of the head of Shin Godzilla. And I know that's not what's actually happening. If you know what the figure is, then you know that that's not a tentacle, but it's not very visible, the rest of the tail from this side. I do feel that they should have maybe pulled it back a little bit so that from this angle it works as well as it does on the other side as well. But that aside, the pose that they chose is very good because it benefits from looking at it from different angles. It doesn't look exactly the same from any certain angle, so it does give this sense of movement, which is really good for photography that I've experienced so far while shooting this figure. No matter how good a sculpt is, a paint job can make or break a figure, and in this case, the paint perfectly complements the sculpt. Shin Godzilla's design makes for a very complex paint scheme that I find can be hard to replicate when figure makers are trying to make a realistic interpretation of Shin Godzilla. Sometimes I find that they can be a little too red, or there's not enough red. In the case of the Sakai 30cm figure, while I do think it is an amazing figure and is considered among many one of the best sculpts of Shin Godzilla, I would say that the stock paint, at least my version, is too red. I've seen people do repaints and really bring it out and look much more correct. And ironically, in the case of the more stylized version of Shin Godzilla with this particular figure, I think that this one has the better stock paint compared to the Sakai 30cm release. And I know that might be a bit of a controversial statement, but I think in certain sections you can really see where the paint is more correct, so to speak. Around the eyes of the stock painted Sakai 30cm, it's way too red. But here with the gigantic Deforeal, the paint honestly looks, I would say, perfect. It's just the right amount of red. And even in certain lighting, it gives this sort of natural glow that almost replicates the look of the smaller Deforeal, the Rick Clear version that I have. When the light hits that one, it creates this natural glow effect, which is supposed to kind of mimic the appearance of Shin Godzilla in the film. And this figure seems to achieve that without actually having the clear vinyl. So I'm very interested in the way that they actually did the paint on this particular figure. The paint that's not red is basically a almost completely black or a very deep charcoal color that really makes him look charred in this particular rendition. The teeth, fingernails, and toenails are all a mix of a monochromatic range of yellows and some beige in there as well, which gives the effect of a very stained and dirtied look. And then the eye itself is white with a gray or greenish iris and a black pupil. Now, unfortunately, in a couple of small sections on the teeth, there are some black scuffs, but that's somewhat unavoidable when it comes to mass-produced figures, or even handmade ones, honestly. But it's nothing that really makes or breaks this figure for me. But the one section I will say that is not very accurate is actually the tip of the tail. Now, in the film, the tip of the tail has a much more bony appearance in terms of its color. While it does have some red and organic biological matter in it, it does look much more skeletal at the tip. And while we do have that in the sculpt, that's not shown here in the paint. Instead, we have this sort of wet-looking red. Has sort of a glossy appearance to it, which honestly is just as gross as it looks in the film. But I'm willing to let it slide just because this is a stylized figure. I'm not exactly sure why they went with this decision, considering the rest of the figure is relatively accurate in terms of the paint. Now, I would say that the second and third forms of Shin Godzilla and the Deforeal form do pair up very nicely with this gigantic Deforeal as well. And while they're not technically in scale with all of each other, they still do look very good with each other, and they make for a great sort of like evolutionary set of Shin Godzilla if you wanted to put these three side by side. This is definitely a great way to approach this series of figures. I also wanted to briefly talk about the tail stand that the figure comes with. I had some trouble at first getting it to stand properly, but I think I figured out actually the best way to put it to use. And normally I don't care for packaging, but let's take a moment to appreciate the nice box that this figure came in. Overall, this is a very impressive release from X Plus, and I'm happy to have it in my collection. The level of detail and craftsmanship represented in this figure is a staple of X Plus, and I always appreciate when this company branches out into something more experimental. The original Deforeal Shin Godzilla is probably a top 5 figure in my entire collection, and we're talking over 100 figures probably. So the idea of a scaled up, even more detailed Deforeal Shin Godzilla is something that really spoke to me. Whether or not the gigantic Deforeal line is something that will continue is too soon to tell, but one thing's for certain. This Shin Godzilla from X Plus is an exceptional release and an awesome addition to my collection that I'm very happy to have. And I found just the right spot to keep it on my shelf. Anyway, this is the end of the video. I really hope you enjoyed the video. I had a lot of fun making it. I always love talking about my Godzilla figures, and this one was no exception. If you're new to the channel and you like the content, please consider leaving a like on this video, subscribing, and taking a look at my other Godzilla figure content on this channel as well. I'm also on Instagram at Total Approximation, where I post Godzilla toy photography each week. Anyway, thank you for watching, and have a good one.